I think for these two episodes, as somebody who is trained and works on literature and particularly and on text, these two episodes that go together, the thing that strikes me most about it is the effort to make language actually mean something. It's a combination between it's a tension between the possibilities of lying in language and controlling a narrative in a particular way, and also trying to tell the truth. And we see it both within the rebellion and within the empire. At the end, at the end of episode 9, when Senator Mothma has already given her speech and she's already been extracted, the rebellion is ready to put together an entirely new narrative about what happened. It was Gold Squadron that extracted her, and here's the brave speech that she's going to give. And this is great because it actually fits with canon if you really want to nerd out about it. But the idea that the rebellion is telling lies about what actually happened is coupled with the news reports we see from the Empire shaping the narrative of what happened on Gorman. The narrative, both of these episodes call into question the possibility of language to be anything other than an instrument of power. And it can be, I think, a little bit disheartening and sort of a sort of a disillusionment that goes along with the people that are participating in rebellion. The ultimate victory, but individual sacrifice. I think I'm focused on language today.
So I think I might be the only one in the crowd who knew nothing about Star Wars, cared nothing about Star Wars until Andor. So I essentially started my introduction to this was a complete opposite order. And the reason that I really liked Andor was because I've been, writing my dissertation and then what became my book and looking at stories and narratives of revolutionaries throughout history, looking at 1917, obviously the Bolshevik Revolution, which obviously inspired this one as well. And everything that I was seeing in the stories didn't match what I was studying. And then, I would present this in political science, whatever, conferences, workshops, and I would have blank faces when I talk about the role of emotions and narratives. And yes, you do need structures, but this is what motivates revolution. And I would get political science blank faces well, causal inference, how do you measure that? And then you watch Andor and you're like, they do it so much better. They do everything that, I formalized in my book when I talked about, how emotions essentially sustain revolution and rebellion. Without it, you can't have it. And I can pretty much map my book entirely on Andor. But I wrote it before. I wrote it before. And you can see that. I mean, you can see both, the structures that maintain rebellions and little by little and how they're organized and how necessary they really are. And you need those early movers to essentially sacrifice themselves and willing to take those risks. I'm going to talk more tomorrow about overcoming those rational calculations where you don't put yourself in danger. Because rebellion needs the opposite. It needs exactly that. It needs you to put yourself in danger, even when it makes absolutely no sense. And you see all of that, and you see the anger and the grief and all of these motivating emotions that make rebellion possible. But I think Andor actually has it a little bit incorrect as to which emotions they emphasize, at least in the narrative, because the emotions are there. You can point them out, but I'll talk more about that tomorrow.
Thanks. Well, so I think the three of us actually fit pretty well here together, which is actually really cool and exciting. I think one of the things that these two episodes sort of really highlighted, and I think to connect to Sarah's opening comments, was the sort of the depth of the logistics on both the Imperial side and the Rebel side, and both in terms of what they're physically doing and how they're organizing things, but also in terms of the depth of their narrative planning. And I think the way that even to the Empire's own people, they're telling different stories at different levels, and that's so deeply connected to the sacrifice that is made, often without choice. And I scribbled down during the first episode, the green soldiers sent into the crowd being told their job is to clear a path to the memorial, their job was to die, right? And just this layering of narrative and logistics and narrative and logistics. When you slice into that and try to understand what's going on, does anyone actually know the full extent of the lies, of the stories, of the logistics? And it seems like the moment they do, like when Cyril finally realizes what's going on, it's too late. And that this sort of violence begets violence is a reinterpreted, sort of made into stories that then motivate additional logistics, additional planning. And so I think the way that this is all strung together shows both the complexity and the depth of it, and the true difficulty of knowing, what does this word mean? What does this word mean in this context, and how does that change over time and place? And I think that really was highlighted in these two episodes.
So we can open it up for questions or comments.
No one else is gonna go there. That's really Disney. Or maximum storytelling in the universe and message, but it is a, a result of our society and our storytelling apparatus, and including the mouse that has a long corporate history and not always as politically informed as this one, or politically proactive perhaps. Can you kind of comment on the storytelling apparatus within the universe and how it works in terms of the tool we're walking in?
Yeah, I mean, I, right, so like, what is the role of the sort of corporate and the storytelling, the capital, right? I think in all of this, and the Tony Gilroy has gone on record saying that Disney said, I cannot say the word fascist, right? And so how do you sort of represent fascist so that everyone knows what fascist is without saying the word fascist? And so I think there were things, especially at this moment in time, looking back on it, that sort of remarkably stand out in terms of the sort of fascist authoritarian playbook, right? And I think things that are clear enough, but also adaptable enough so that if you recognize fascism in any of its locations or places in the real world, you will see it reflected here. And so my thought was, when the Imperial Green Forces, the new guys went out to clear that path, that was using a military battalion for domestic policing, right? My mind went to Washington, D.C., right, to any of the places that the National Guard have been deployed domestically, but I think that travels internationally. And so I think it was actually a very clever storytelling mechanism to take the playbook, put it in the Star Wars universe, but then never say the word fascist because he couldn't, because of his negative offense. We can't sort of hit the nail on the head, but we can dance around it in a way that's actually quite direct, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna say, I think a little bit more about this tomorrow. But one of the comforting elements, one of the strange tensions, I think, of Andor is that we know how it ends. We know that they make it worth it. And so the question becomes, like, what message are they sending? Well, is it worth it? You will lose individually everything you love. Everybody you care about will die, and you might be one of them. But the rebellion will be fine. They'll blow up the Death Star. So I think when you're thinking about, well, how does this message get through a corporation? Well, it's a warning individually not to mess with them. If you want to flourish, then rebellion is not the way to go.
I think the opposite can also be interpreted quite clearly from the whole series, obviously. Because the end, I mean, I love the ending, the moment where Dedra Meero is arrested and you see her face and she realizes that, it's over for her, that everything she worked for is nothing. I think that is as much of a warning about, rebellion can succeed, rebellion does succeed eventually. The cost is incredibly high, but there is internal inconsistencies to the empire that is going to make it collapse. And to me, that's something that I always try to emphasize, I mean, to my students especially, because it's like, it's tough. But look, it cannot sustain itself. It cannot, even its, most ardent soldiers end up, disillusioned and punished by the mechanisms they built.
Well, so I mean, maybe to the first question, the depressing question, right? I think there are people using language instrumentally, right? There's an upstairs, downstairs distinction, right? Like, I think, during the introduction, like all the underlaborers who are, right, like the guy who says turn to channel 2, right? Like, they know exactly, like language being used instrumentally, they know exactly what they're doing. They probably have a fairly synoptic view of it, actually, because it's their job to do it, right? And they're not supposed to talk about it. And like, like the underlaborers in our empire, right? Like they're not supposed to use rhetoric, and when they do come out and speak rhetorically, when Lieutenant Colonel Bindman stops being a faceless bureaucrat and tries to become the voice of democracy, right? Like he kind of can't work at the White House anymore. He's burned now, right? Because that's actually a betrayal of something you're supposed to do it. So those things are there, right? It's just that, there's a bit of a class distinction there, and maybe to your point also, it's probably not a coincidence that all the army jargon is British army jargon, right? Like stand to, and right, that all that stuff is right. Like that, maybe that is another layer of deniability. We don't have that layer, it's only that, right? Or I'm not sure, but I found that the one thing though, I do wonder, there's this story that part of what journalists have done with this administration is that by summarizing a long, incoherent speech, because you're a journalist and it's your job to turn something into a story, you actually give something that is completely coherent, kind of the cohesiveness of narrative, and then you actually domesticate it. So one argument about revolutions and things like this is, we are scholars, and so we see the collective contradictions of a system, and we want to think that systems collapse because of the way that they're collecting contradictions, because that's what we're trained to look for. But in the end, people are doing a million different things, and what makes the empire collapse, like what makes the revolution work, is, there's more books being written now about the French Revolution than there were. There's more books written about the French Revolution every year. So I wonder. These are, so I'm throwing these out just for responses, and they're not really very good questions, I suppose, but it's a complicated thing.
Patrick got a two-meter.
I want to pick up on the point about we know how it ends. We know how it ends. We know actually that even blowing up the Death Star isn't the end of it. We know that what makes the Empire fall isn't actually the rebellion. What makes the Empire fall is Luke refusing to kill his father and Palpatine being thrown down a shaft, right? There's a piece of context of these two episodes that I think is important to make sure we're all on the same page about, because just before this is the Force Humor episode, right? So there's this moment where Andor, Cassian is actually indicated as something of someone that the Force is using to do various things. You see Bix kind of alluding to that in the farewell speech. And one of the things that's the genius about the way they've done Andor is that up until that point in the series, you've never heard anything about the underlying mythology of the Star Wars world. And now you start to get hints, right? This idea, even Luthen notices it, right? So like, oh, you're always there when I need you. So it gets the sense that actually maybe the message here isn't about small acts, and it isn't actually about rebellion, and it isn't actually about the incoherence of the Empire ultimately dooming the Empire. This is the story ultimately about there being a magical force that is propelling events in various ways, which in some ways links us back to Disney, which is a fairy tale company. Sure. And this is what Disney's good at. Disney's very good at fairy tales. I'll say this again probably tomorrow in my thing, but like when I first watched Andor, I had a hard time with season. I had a very hard time. I was like, this is sort of set in the Star Wars universe, but not really Star Wars. And then by the time we got to this point, I was like, oh, I get it now. I get it now. Now I understand how it links back into the overall mythology.
Ask a question about, just following up on Jim's comment about sort of the way in which the violence is segmented in sort of these spaces, like, your comment made me think of Tim Catcherad's every 12 seconds. He talks about, since in the Assault House for like 8 or 9 months, he talks about the ways in which violence is sort of segmented to protect people from having to see the entire process. But in this series, I'm thinking about that in relation to how that opens opportunity for rebellion. So what is it about bureaucratic rote that is sort of like organized in that way that gives space for folks to enter spaces for the purpose of rebellion, right? That sort of like routinized ways in which people interact, and the sort of easy language that people use and easy dress and style people use to enter spaces. Just thinking a little, I was curious about if folks could talk a little bit about how that opens opportunities specifically for the kind of insurrection that we're seeing sort of portrayed in the, or things.
I'm still comments. Yeah, I mean, I think. Right, is this a story about the aggregate effect of individual acts of rebellion being more and more tightly tied and densely connected to a single idea about what the ultimate goal is? I think the answer to that depends on what's the time horizon that you're looking at, right? Are we sort of looking at and highlighting internal risk, or are we looking at the sort of global outcome, right? Are we thinking about the way that individuals act, or are we thinking about how the way that individuals are connected to organizations and organizations are embedded, right, in other sets of relations and networks? And so is there a magical force, right? Disney, the storyteller, or is it that do we sort of have a human need to find meaning in disparate and unconnected events, right? And so, I don't necessarily think that the way that Andor is telling things is ultimately controlled by the force, right? I think there is some reality, right, or some sort of broader picture about what does it take to organize, to continue to sacrifice, right, to sort of spread the narrative, right? And I think this connects to the bureaucratic question, right? Is how does that bureaucratic rote, these sort of routinized ways, provide opportunity for insurrection? And I think the best example of that is in episode 9, those 2 people who are like, well, you can't open the door. Really sorry, right? And then you see the guy running down the hall and finally doing it. And there was a delay of maybe 20-30 seconds, right? It wasn't a lot, but in some ways, I think deferring to the bureaucratic route, especially when bureaucracy is so embedded and so hierarchical, lets you lean into it when you don't want to do something. And then on the sort of different way of continuing that is that when bureaucratic route just becomes standard operating procedure and everyone expects you to do what you have done as you have done before, that expectation can sometimes give a gap in the oversight, right? And lets you sort of resist in very sort of quotidian, unnoticed ways, because it looks like you're behaving the part of the bureaucratic sort of drone, right? And so I think that's where the bureaucracy opens up those opportunities, is in letting people say, oh yeah, I'm just doing my job, I'm just doing my job. Like wink, wink, I'm gonna delay you by 20 seconds.
Other questions? Comments? Sarah, final thoughts?
I actually was sitting here sort of mulling over it. It was like, if you are a system that is based on extremely strict control and rules, and sort of, if we think about the aesthetics of fascism and particularly in Andor, but also if you go into the original trilogy, I can't even get into the aesthetics of the prequels, but it's the kind of world in which a grain of sand scratches the surface. right? And it's hard to disrupt chaos, right? But it's easy to disrupt a system that is premised on rule following, on strict hierarchy, on rules, that has very little flexibility built into the system. And where, if you think about the original trilogy, where sort of any failure is actually a lethal mistake, right? And I'm trying to think, do we only see defection in Rogue One? The pilot defects in Rogue One, right? So we get Galen Erso and the pilot in Rogue One, where we're sort of coming to the crescendo of the Death Star being operational. And then you would see defections in the sequels too, but I don't count that as canon. But there's actually sort of a curious thing going on as a system that is premised on this reproduction of rules and hierarchies, and that is portrayed as being like flawless. Like, I even think of how it invades Deirdre's like domestic life. Like, it looks like she lives in a laboratory. Her apartment looks like a laboratory, right? And it's this sort of thing where you could run a white glove over the counter, and that's all part of the story. But it's also very easy to mess that up, right? Which gets to the sort of weapons of the week, like any deviation is cause for upset. So I do think there's something there in terms of that lack of flexibility, that insistence on full control actually opens up the space for rebellion, and we see the defections. And if we think about the role of that pilot in the defection, like, yes, the Force is leading people, but there are also all these contingencies. And it's actually interesting if we think about the defection of that pilot because of Galen Erso also being one of those linchpin moments.
And Darth Vader's kind of the ultimate defection.
Yeah.
And I know you don't want to talk about the prequels, but the indictment of the Jedi Order in the prequels is precisely that it's become a hidebound, rule-governed, bureaucratic entity.
Yeah.
As exemplified by Anakin's frustration with attempting to do this, which is then, of course, nicely manipulated by Palpatine. But so you've got an indictment of bureaucratic precision in both the Empire and in the Jedi Order. And if you go and read the High Republic novels, they're actually doing the same thing back with the sort of High Republic stuff, sort of showing the ways in which this same sort of problems happen.
Was it the series where they show the post-rebellion sort of world of the Republic is sort of picking up the basic institutions and even like workers from the Empire to keep up?
Mandalorian.
Is it?
Yeah, the
Mandalorian. Yeah.
Well, they don't debathify. This one debathify.
Or it doesn't work.
Right.
I think on the aesthetics of the Empire, non-fascism, because we can't say the word. There's that lovely sort of metaphorical scene where Miro is losing it. And she's repeatedly trying to yank her uniform back into some semblance of order. And every time she pulls, she makes it worse. And it's exactly, it was really beautifully done. But yeah, I think the writers are clear on this effort to hold to image, to hold to narrative, and to maintain control. And the harder they pull at their uniform, the more out of place it gets.
I think for me though, that's precisely the thing that makes Andor a little bit more detached from reality. Because here you have a bureaucracy it functions pretty well. Like, it has its problems, it has its openings, which will eventually lead to its demise, but it functions a lot better than a lot of fascistic governments that we have. There was a moment, and I might have missed it, I'm not sure if it was in episode 8 or a previous episode, when a senator from Gorman says that, they don't even bother to lie, they lie badly, or they don't even lie properly to us. And then, the winner rising the narrative, but they attempt to have a real narrative. I mean, with Gorman, they find the the government will do the, I don't know, the quote, will do the right thing wrongly or something. Did you read out that particular quote? They're putting so much effort in the narrative, and yes, they don't have control over it because yes, you've got defectors, but I don't know, I find it, it's not stupid as a lot of other narratives on politics and fascism that we see today. So there's real effort, and the bureaucracy is a lot more efficient, I think, than the revolutions that inspired the writing for Andor.
I think on that point, one would wanna make a distinction between sort of like the rhetoric that that regimes use to justify themselves versus like, George Orwell has this famous, you know, line of Unicorn, right? He has this famous thing about like, we're gonna have a communist revolution here in England, but it's gonna be English, it's gonna be kind of ramshackle, like the judges will still wear wigs and red robes. And there's that kind of, well, we're a liberal empire, and so it's all sort of ramshackle, and it's a little bit run down, and therefore it's not incredibly violent and destructive and rapine, right? Because we're not like Germany. And that's a story about bureaucracy that's an ideology about bureaucracy that makes bureaucracy, that justifies bureaucracy. But it's English, doesn't really work all that well, and therefore the Mau can't really be, the Mau revolt can't really be that bad, right? Because we can't have concentration camps because we're not organizing it. In the fascist one, right? There's a story about, you know, the brown battalions all kind of marching in order, right? And maybe that's true, maybe that's not, because we know that behind the scenes, this guy's fighting that guy, and you know, it's more about how the distinction between those regimes, I mean to suggest, is in how the bureaucracy is portrayed, not in what it is. Does that make sense? And so, like, they're all marching in lockstep, right? Is a story about that fascism wants to tell itself about what it's doing, about how it's getting a bunch of different minds to act as one, right? Despite all the forces that want to make, right? And we want to confuse that with the actual bureaucracy, which is, you know, ruled by nobody is ruled by nobody in a lot of places.
And the trains didn't actually run on time.
Right. And they will involve, and there will be people who can skillfully kind of throw sand into the gears, and there will be people who can oil the gears, and there will be, but all those things are there. But and I mean, like, if you go behind the scenes, like we're in a library, but if you go behind the scenes in the Wishelton department, like, you'll see all the exact same dynamics there too, right? The stakes are low, right? But they're all still there.
I don't think there's stacks anymore.
Right, yeah, I mean, I'm showing my age, but like,
Back when we were kids. All you have to do to make the empire fall is follow its directions. And follow what? Hey, we fixed the door, and then it just messed us.
Any final comments?
I mean, maybe to just sort of bring us into tomorrow, like, I think one of the things that, you know, my fellow commenters' comments and all of the, Q&A and discussions pointed out is I think deeply connected to Nemec's manifesto, right? Which says sort of very clearly in the middle, authority is brittle. And I think, and I'll build on this tomorrow, but right, so Yoda says, do or not do, there is no try. And I think if there was a mantra to Andor, it would be try, right? Because we can't immediately identify something as success or failure, but it is that very process of trying that introduces the sand, it introduces the dirt to the pristine counter, right? And starts that process, I think, of destabilization, often in ways that are incredibly, seemingly inconsequential, right? And so I think the capturing of the try is like really central to the rebellions are built on hope. Rebellions might succeed, but there might be substantial individual sacrifice. I think that all is wrapped up in this.
I will say, I do want to amend something. I think now Brian's question has really made me think, but there's something, I think that there's something to, we only see the defections in Rogue One, but Luthen, Dodonna, and Drevon are all former military, right? And there's something to that. Like, they are actually bringing order to the chaos and the early cells and all of that. And there's probably something more to play with there. We don't see it. But there is actually a lesson into that you do have to order the rebellion, right? You can't just throw things at the wall of fascism. Like, you actually have to make some fairly hard choices about who is giving orders, and that is actually tough for a lot of people, Cassian being one of them.
Well, thanks a lot. I want to, thank you all. First night. And I'll pick it up tomorrow.